All right, good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you are in the world. Today is Thursday, August 30th, 2018. I am your co-lead of the SIG, which is SIG Architecture. Make sure you're in the right place. And the agenda, should you want to follow after the fact, is at bit.ly/sig-architecture. We have 3 tracking boards that we follow. If you go to those meeting minutes, you will see a link to those boards. And they're under the Kubernetes SIGs org, and it's called architecture-tracking. So today, I went through the boards, and it didn't look like there was anything new or changed that we need to review. So we're going to go ahead and go into the regular part of the agenda. And before we do, are there any questions or anything anybody has as far as those 3 boards, or anything that we need to add or move cards across the boards?
I actually had a question about how we are supposed to get cards moving between the columns in those boards. So I know of at least 3 things that are in progress that aren't reflected on those. Are we supposed to be pinging you or commenting in the tracking issues, or how does that work mechanically?
Ideally, it happens where somebody like you brings us up in a meeting, and we pull up the board, and you tell me what moves over, so that everybody has visibility of the cards moving, just to understand what things are moving in the project. So, which ones are you thinking of, in caps or?
These were. Let me copy the issues in. So issue 49 in the architecture tracking repo. There's a run as group API review, which is in progress.
Okay, let me put that in there. And where should that go? In review underway?
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And then the one tracking dynamic audit configuration should also go in review underway.
What is the number on that one?
I just put it in the chat. It's 14.
Okay.
I know we're still kind of getting this process going, but
yes,
every little bit we can do to raise visibility to the types of pull requests that need to be tracked this way would be helpful. So I don't know if someone who has bought skills and rights, we're already labeling pull requests that involve API with specific API related labels. Even adding a comment to those pulls saying, make sure there's a tracking issue for this so it is in the API review pipeline would be helpful. So I don't know what's involved in that, or
yeah, I'm not sure either. That's something that I would have aspired to or dreamed of for this process, so that we can have more automation around these tracking boards. Because right now it's yours truly doing this, and it's it's kind of a pain. Definitely, if anybody in the SIG is interested in stepping up into helping figure that out, I would love to do that. So feel free to ping me offline, and we'll go from there. All right, and I've added those. Anything else?
I had a general question with regards to process for conformance acceptance.
Yeah.
We currently have specified, and I don't know how that came to being, that final approvers for any conformance changes would be Clayton or Brian versus originally when we spec'd it out, it was supposed to be SIG Architecture. So the question I have is just bandwidth questions, and whether or not this group should be empowered to make the final call on some of these things.
I can answer that.
Wow. Brian, we can't hear you. You muted yourself.
Can you hear me?
It's still echoing quite badly.
Disconnected.
How about now?
Way better.
Okay. Room mic. How about now?
It's good.
Okay. Yeah, so what happened was, first of all, there is no such thing as SIG architecture as like a well-defined group or process. So that was something that we were trying to work out as we were hashing out sub-projects for the SIG, whereas the conformance definition and approval was one of the sub-projects, not the entire SIG. We started with a subset of the API approvers who were actually involved in deciding what things should be need to be compatible across all Kubernetes clusters. So that requires understanding of our architectural requirements, API requirements, expectations of Kubernetes in different environments and things like that. So we just started with a super small subset so we could lean towards consistency, maximizing consistency as we develop the criteria for what is conformant and what is not conformant. So the main thing that is blocking adding people to that set is bringing more people up to speed on the criteria and expectations. Exactly, Aaron posted to the chat there. So that is underway right now, and definitely we want to grow the set of people. In terms of bandwidth, July and August were just brutal for me, but I'm hoping, I have reason to believe, I would say, it's not just hope, I have reason to believe that September will be better, and that iterating on the process is the top priority for the conformance test reviews, not just pounding out the reviews, but using the reviews that are coming through as an opportunity to refine those criteria. And I think we made some useful progress on that in August. And definitely by the end of September, I would like to see those criteria much more complete. So that is how it started and how we got to where we are.
Okay, that seems reasonable. I know there are people who are actively working on this. Myself and Dims have worked on it since Epoch. So we'd happily probably like to be involved in that too as well.
Okay, so we should get you and Dims and Aaron at least as a starting point together and start having some regular discussions to make sure we're all on the same page about the criteria. And I think the biggest issue is if there are any questions about whether something should be conformant or not. Well, and Clayton, if you can track him down and he has time. If there are any questions on, should this be conformant or not, we raise that to the group and we come to an answer and we write it down. I think that's the number one process that we need to develop. Maybe a mailing list of the approvers or soon to be approvers or something like that, and we can start hashing this out. Like I would love it if you and Dims and Aaron and others could do first cut reviews and say, I think this looks good. There are no questions. The criteria covered everything in this test, and then we can go from there. Does that sound reasonable?
Yep, sounds great.
Okay. Do you want to start doing that, fielding the things that are in the tracking board?
I've been doing it informally, but I can do it via the tracking board, sure.
Yeah. So if you could make sure that the conformance criteria that are documented cover, or where they don't, raise that as an issue, that would be awesome. And then we can start, expanding the scope.
I've been trying to treat it as I don't assign it to you and Clayton until I think it is ready for you to rubber stamp it. And if you send it back for some reason, that helps me understand what the further criteria are. But I agree. I think maybe just a mailing list thread on SIG architecture is all we really need for asynchronous collaboration and stuff that's not spread across a bunch of PRs.
Yeah, that's simpler for my email filters for sure. Because I'm not as sophisticated at filter wise as Tim is. So either Tim.
Nobody as sophisticated as Tim is.
Yeah, I've been meaning to investigate some interesting things that the Gmail people told me, but I just haven't had time.
And just for what it's worth, I know I'm super behind on both filling that board back up with some things and also getting a Google Doc of the conformance definition out for us to iterate on, because I'm assuming that ideally would be a place to land as many of those criteria as possible in a very thorough list. So been occupied with other stuff this week. I think I can get to that. You'll see it out there by next week.
Cool.
And it would probably make sense at some point, once the sub-projects have more formal or at least more standardized members, that we add them to the admin group for the tracking board so that they can move cards across and manage their own sub-projects.
We can probably do that already for the.
There's very low risk in that. It's more just confusion, which we have plenty of that already. So
yeah, well, that's where just communication is important, I guess.
Yeah.
And yeah, mailing list is way better than Slack. I just cannot monitor Slack.
Yep.
Although now that we have history, I can go back and look, but I don't pull it that frequently.
Okay. So action item there is if anybody in this meeting is involved in a sub-project and tracking those things, caps, conformance reviews, etc., just talk to Brian. He will add you to the admin groups for the tracking board so you can also add and categorize and stuff. I think for sure Jordan, Aaron, Tim are people who should have that ability. So both Tims.
Yeah, so while we're on the topic of API reviews in KEPs, I added a line item, which I hope will be quick to the agenda. So I started looking through some KEPs, and I felt they were of roughly two shapes, like incremental features, which are fine-ish, and bigger changes, which not even like super major changes, but just sort of scope creepy kind of changes. And that's where I felt like I didn't have a good enough understanding of where the SIG was headed to review that individually. So I was asked for sort of bigger picture information on a couple of them. But in general, I think it would help to have that bigger picture vision and roadmap from the SIGs to put those things in context in advance of receiving a KEP for a specific detail. I know the SIGs are already presenting regularly to the community meeting. So the thing I wanted to ask is, do we want to just ask SIGs to include that vision and big picture roadmap in their community presentation, and then we can ask details via email, or do we want them to regularly also present to SIG Architecture as a prerequisite for getting their stuff reviewed? Like we use that kind of carrot/stick for SIG charters and repos, saying, you have to enumerate all your sub-projects before you can get repos. So we could say, well, you need to have a roadmap so we understand where you're going before you get any API or KEP reviews. What do people think about that?
I think that's rough to enforce, because like the roadmaps change wildly from SIG to SIG, and it changes over time too, because it's a volunteer army, right? So like people show up, and some people throw down and help do the work and things get done faster, and sometimes people disappear, and what you thought was going to be done in a cycle doesn't get done for a year.
I don't care as much about whether a specific thing gets done in the next release as this is the stuff people believe is important and the direction they're headed. And if they know what people are working on, that helps put things in context. If that changes, that doesn't bother me as much. But it's more about, well, is more work going to be done in this direction, or it's going to be left? This is just like a point-wise thing, or is it going to shift direction into another direction? Especially when we get KEPs from different people that are in different directions over time. Like in one release, one person submits one KEP and does some work, and then the next one there's something in the different direction. I'm starting to see a lot of evidence of that as the project has become more and more fragmented and people are just focusing on their individual little things. I understand it's a volunteer army, but you know, if the system is gonna remain coherent, one way to preserve coherency is to say no. Like, even if people stop working on one thing, that doesn't mean we have to allow work on something else that conflicts with the overall direction in that area.
I do worry a little bit about if the process becomes too onerous, that people are just going to bypass it, because the volunteer army doing a volunteer process that gets labyrinthine gets scary, because people will just opt out.
I am concerned about that. I mean, that's why I was wondering, a lightweight way maybe just ask for one slide in the community presentations that we already asked to do.
That would be, I think we should have that anyway, because I have, and I know other people, especially in SIG PM, have hand wrung about this before, that if we don't know where we're going at least a couple iterations ahead, we're kind of just floating aimlessly, and that's not a good thing. That's not a good user story. So I think that having some direction, at least on some of these high-level things, even if it's a single slide, is super useful.
And the other alternative is I'll just ask on each individual thing that I have time to stumble across for somebody to go off and write the bigger picture, and then they'll, yeah.
Jordan?
I think presenting it in the community meeting is a good idea. I think if you are looking at a particular cap or a particular design and trying to figure out, does this align with where the SIG is going, where the project is going, having to then hunt through community meetings to find content is not great. So asking for it to be reflected in some way in the SIGs folder under community, or tied to subprojects, or something where, like, oh, this is SIG auth and SIG API machinery. Let me go look at those two SIGs and like make sure this isn't diametrically opposed to their vision and roadmap. Will those things get out of date? Probably. Should there be like a, here are the 5 things the SIG is working on that's kept reasonably up to date? Probably should be. So if we notice it's out of date, we'll ask for it to be updated. But having an asynchronous way to find that in a consistent place for each SIG seems not unreasonable to me.
I like that. I just wrote that down in the notes. Okay. I think that's good feedback. That's all I have for that topic.
Shouldn't it also like be a responsibility of both the SIG leads as well as architecture to rationalize some of the KEPs that have occurred over time, if there are inconsistencies? To have I mean, the purpose of a KEP is meant to be a living document, not just a document you publish once and then it gets implemented. It's meant to be a document that it revolves over time or evolves over time, so that way it's living and breathing, and it should either be deprecated in favor of the new implementation or the new design or whatever. So the life cycle of these things matters too as well, right?
Yeah, I don't disagree. I think that's going to require outreach from this group to go to the SIGs, and that's something I've been meaning to do, but like I said, July and August were just brutal.
I think that
everybody's just kind of heads down and working, plotting forward, and not really taking a step back. So I think there needs to be some sort of forcing function for that. Go ahead.
It was me, and I think there's 2 things that would help. One is, so I had designed this just rough planning document that we could execute per SIG before each release kicks off. It doesn't have to be very heavyweight. It's just a way to undangle dependencies and have some idea what the roadmap looks like, etc. That may be something that we could facilitate. And I believe that SIG PM is highly interested in facilitating that work. So there could be some good cross collaboration as far as not having to have us be the ones who are executing on this this pull from the SIGs. So I'm more than happy to be the bridge between those 2 works. And I know that Stephen Augustus is interested in this as well. So I might ask if he's interested in volunteering for that work, because I think he would be a good candidate for that. So this is one of those things where I think we should make use of our governance model to help us accomplish something that 2 different SIGs have as a desire.
Okay, I'm all in favor of sharing the work. Tracking that down. So you're going to follow up with SIG PM? He's typing it in, so I guess that's a yes.
Muting, yes, I was muted. Yeah, so I'll follow up there, and I'll have a readout on that. Probably not next week because it's an off week, but the following week. And next up is P. Barker. Forgive me if I don't know who that is. I think it's Patrick, right?
Yeah, it's me. Yep.
Okay, cool.
I can explain it real quick. That's okay.
Sure.
So we were working on the dynamic out of work. Recently, it's kind of come up that maybe we should be doing this out of tree, and proposes that maybe we should bring this up to this group here to kind of talk that over before we go forward. So just wanted to have a discussion here on whether that makes sense for something that we're building like this to be out of tree, and also considering, we did the cap with the idea of this being in tree, and just get a little guidance and advice from you guys on that.
Say again what the effort is. I didn't catch it.
They're adding dynamic configuration to audit logs.
Ah, okay.
Which I was going to say, I am ordinarily I'm like, yes, go build it out of tree, but we're actually configuring API server to talk to audit logs. Is that correct?
Yeah, so it's a little bit of a tricky place where we could, in theory, maybe do part of it out of tree, but we really wouldn't be testing the majority of the functionality in it.
We're directly configuring API server. That doesn't seem like a good thing for like a CRD or being out of.
So
out of tree.
who asked for it to be out of tree or suggested that it be out of tree?
It was just suggested recently in the PR by Tim Allclair, because he's doing the kubelet work for the runtime class, and it was requested that he do that out of tree. So now he's asking, can we double check that this is okay to do in tree here?
Appreciate you coming by. There's some amount of confusion as the message propagates around the community about moving things out of tree. Sorry, this is Tim. I agree with Daniel. It seems a little bit fraught to be out of tree. And yeah, that's my feeling.
Well, until we move the whole API server out of tree, which I hope to do eventually.
Yeah.
Yeah. Jordan, did you have any thoughts on that?
I think that the API server, depending on something that is not built into the API server, is not a great idea. So it makes sense to me to have it be direct. Part of the question here was the overall desire to define all APIs as CRDs versus, like, are there ones that the API server depends on versus other ones the kubelet depends on, and kind of maybe rationalizing where we draw the line, because I think there has been conflicting advice given. And then the other piece was just the timing of this at this point in the release. And that was more of a particular to this effort. Like, is it at this point in the cycle, is it appropriate to be merging this API? Are we confident in it? But that wasn't really a philosophical question.
The answer to that is just no.
The specific thing about making this a CRD is, like, there's some strange bootstrapping thing you have to figure out, because API server needs to configure audit logging before it starts at the CRD server. So
that's also
it's not an impossibility, but it's definitely a unique complication for this particular issue that others don't have.
Yeah, I mean, CRD or built-in type is sort of a different question of in tree or in staging or out of tree. Those are sort of, or somewhat orthogonal issues. So has the API, what stage is it? The API out for review, or?
Yeah, it's been reviewed for a little while now. I think a couple weeks. This is something we're really pushing for 112, and I understand that's an aggressive timeline. Trying to see if that's still a possibility.
One of the things to denote here too, sorry to interrupt you, Patrick, is that it's entirely feature gated off by default. So it's totally an opt-in behavior.
And it's going to be an alpha API, so the entire API will be disabled.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was taking the configuration API that is currently fed in as a file to the API server to say, enable these audit events filtered this way. And it is making it controllable via a REST API. So that same file-based API, you can have multiple instances of it directing audit events to multiple sinks. And so it was largely a lift and shift of the current file configuration into a REST resource with some jumping through hoops to deal with API machinery. Oddity is doing that.
So it already had a component config style format?
Yeah.
And there's another question, I guess, there, which was that we had to copy one of the existing objects, which is the policy piece, into what we're exposing as the REST API. And now we may want changes there. So I guess there's just a question of, should those things be synced in some capacity? We couldn't import it directly because of import restrictions. So just a question, if we're taking it from the command line, should we have those two things, synced up in some capacity?
Well, in general, we're moving away from command line flags towards component configuration and real APIs. If there is a component configuration format, I think it is desirable for the types to remain the same. And that seems simpler. At Modulo, our deprecation policy, right? Even for administratively configured things like flags or component config, there is a deprecation policy. Otherwise, it breaks installers and things like that.
Yeah. And the experience that we've had with the current file-based format has largely proven that it kind of balances expressiveness and complexity pretty well. Like you can filter out things you don't want, you can include things you do want.
I think part of what we're talking about here is that I did a first pass on the API and I hadn't seen the flat file before and asked for a bunch of changes because it's very similar to the webhook configuration API, which I found confusing. So I'm not sure how legitimate it is to work on reconciling that versus how we want to optimize for ease of development and
well, if it's significantly different, not just like different in small ways, then effectively you could treat it as a new version. I mean, we don't have to actually convert between them, but
yeah, we don't have to. Yeah, that's kind of what I was feeling would be ideal, but I mean, I asked for a lot of changes.
Yeah, I think the goals of the audit filtering and the goals of the admission webhook registration are a little bit different. So one is wanting to allow omitting noisy things. So known users, for example, like known controllers that are really active. We want to be able to audit them at a lower verbosity level, or so there's like more individual addressability that's desired for the audit registration piece as opposed to webhook admission.
like don't audit events, stuff like that.
Don't audit events, or only let me know about metadata level changes for like this really high traffic controller.
I see.
Yeah, so like the webhook configuration API uses stars if you want to select multiple groups. This one uses empty lists if you want to select multiple groups, which, I don't know, using empty lists for this is a pet peeve of mine, but yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I haven't followed the recent conversation on this because I said my piece on like Monday and then we had a pretty busy couple days here.
Jason, I'm not sure I understood your question.
Oh, could any of the implementation details basically interfere? Like, so let's say that you turn the alpha API on, it just was making sure there wasn't any bad neighbor effect. Maybe not how it's designed, but I didn't look at it.
If it makes the API server crash loop, it would.
That's what I was kind of getting at.
If you turn on the alpha API,
Yeah.
As badly as
maybe.
we want it, do we really want to be merging APIs during code slush?
Yeah, I would say we should just not set that precedent.
I agree. It's not that I don't want the feature. It's that this is basically the very end of the release. It's the day before freeze.
Yeah, I I understand it's aggressive, and if Joe were here, he's unfortunately camping. He's just highly, highly invested in this, and it's just basically sent us to plead, on your behalf that maybe we do allow it this one time. I guess that's the most I can offer. It is fully feature gated and stable. Heptio is committed to the stability of the feature and committed to continuing it going forward and iterating on it in alpha and doing everything we can to make it stable.
Tim?
I think the conundrum here is the part that I want to speak up about is that we have a process that we've kind of articulated on and we've tried to define, and we've kind of adhered to that process very strictly and done our level best along the way. And at the 11th out for this feature, right? And it's kind of taken a while to get to this point, but then there was like sudden pushback at the end. So it's not necessarily frustrating for me as much. I think it's more frustrating for Patrick and for other folks who are trying to help it along the way, to try and make sure that, if we are going to state that we are going to do something and the SIG leads buy into that and they offer to review it within that time frame, to get it pushed out at the end of the cycle can be disheartening for a lot of contributors if this is their first time they're actually actively contributing to the community.
Yeah, and that is one of the problems that we're trying to address by having a more explicit API review process and kept process and things like that.
I
was gonna go ahead, Jordan.
Go ahead, Clayton.
Or Tim, I was gonna add, I think the problem is like on the architecture API lead thing is that we're the people who have to say no to a lot of people, and so after a while saying no to people because it's the right thing to do for the project as a whole, it is sometimes you lose kind of it's a delicate balance between making sure that you say no in the nicest possible way but still saying no, because everything can wait except does the next release of the software actually work or not. And it's kind of this, I feel like this is the tension here, is we're trying to enact like we don't have to ship everything on the hard boundaries, because the only thing that's important is can someone upgrade from Kubernetes 1.11 to 1.12 as safely as possible, and we don't take down their clusters. And so the balance of bias is every bit of risk is still a risk, but then the counter pressure is there are legitimate features that make people's lives easier. It's just harder when they're in alpha to justify that extra step, because an alpha feature is always less important than stability. And that's the tension I feel like we're in this case.
Yeah, and that bar is just getting higher and higher. I think the real answer to this is going to be something like feature branches or something like that, so that we can actually keep Kubernetes master in a more releasable state and consider changing the release cadence at some point.
So I agree with all that. I also want to be principled about it. Sorry, Andy, go ahead.
Thanks, Tim. So I've been in Patrick's place before, and I understand what everyone is saying, and I think I probably agree that as much as we would like to get it in to 1.12, it's late. But at the same time, I do want to echo what Tim said about process. In this particular case, the API or the proposed API changes were in the KEP. The KEP was reviewed, its status was changed to implementable. And again, it's kind of like a 11th hour, let's pull back. So what I would ask is that in the future, we don't get to implementable and then decide that we need to change things. It's not avoidable 100% of the time, but I think given that the KEP went through multiple rounds of reviews from different SIGs, ideally those things would get shaken out during that review time. So when it moves to implementable, you can go forward.
I just want to make one quick comment on that, which is one of the number one things I wanted from the CUP process is to make sure that we had a clear process for assigning approvers to the CUP to address this exact issue. Because when it's not clear who the approver is, then this kind of 11th hour objection thing can always happen. But if people agree on who gets to approve it up front, then I feel that could address this thing.
Yeah, I was going to ask, like, was an API approver, like, does a CAP going to implementable imply that the API has been approved?
I'm having a lot of trouble hearing. I can't hear Daniel at all.
Sorry, I'm asking if we set a CAP to be implementable, does that imply that the API design in it has been approved? Like,
I have always assumed not. I had assumed that we would still tag the approvers and they still get a say.
Yeah, I would assume that that it's still pending an API review.
Well,
Well,
there's
did Jordan, did you review and approve it, the API?
I had not yet. So the part of it was timing. So the KEP came in like right around feature freeze is when it kind of got this expanded scope. And while I don't disagree with the goal of making the policy be dynamic, I had not gotten I hadn't gotten through it yet. And so it wasn't I disapprove of this, but it also was in the backlog behind other things that had been in the backlog longer.
So did any API approver sign off on it? Like, we only have
on the KEP?
In the KEP or in the API review, did either you or Clayton or Eric or Tim, the other Tim Hawken, sign off on it?
There were API reviewers. In the first one, there were two. In the second one, there was one. They reviewed it. There was not like a sign off. They were reviewers and not approvers. And that's just kind of how it was set up. I'm not sure who suggested that be the setup at first, but I mean, I definitely think maybe going forward, if it's an API change, it should be an approver.
Well, the intent of the reviewers is to have first line review done by a broader pool of people, and then final to hopefully get all the obvious things and to go to approvers for the final.
I think we can clarify for future KEPs that if you're proposing API changes, you should get an API reviewer who at least do a course level review at the KEP stage. It doesn't need to be not an approver, just reviewers.
Yes.
Right. And so I'm saying we should get one of the approvers to say, fundamentally, this is not going the wrong way.
Reviewers.
But I don't think the KEP should be marked implementable if the API hasn't been approved.
Well, so I think there's two parts here. My bias would be, I think it would be good. Like, so in this case, like, I think the API reviewers were saying and approvers were saying they were good with the first part, but the dynamic policy was the late breaking part. I do think there's a part between you approve the KEP implementable, you should absolutely be able to go, but you can't merge until the API is finally signed off on, because an implementation isn't a doc isn't the implementation. I do think that there's no point to going far into implementable unless there's a chance that it's going to get implemented. So I would agree that we should try as much as possible to front load KEP plus approval of the high ideal. But if there's changes, is that during the implementation? Are we going to kick you back to the KEP, or?
That's one of the things we've wrestled with. Like, it's really common to see a design and it lays out the types and the data flow and everything, and then you get to implementing it and you realize, oh, like there's one other field we need to actually make this work. And like you want to kind of be able to say that the idea was approved, the design was approved. Here we are with the implementation PR. Like, here's the delta between what we looked at before and what we realized we needed when we got into it. Can we review what we have now? Go ahead, Tim.
That was exactly what I meant. I do not expect that the final implementation of a PR and the thing that was in the KEP are going to be the same in almost any cases. But I do expect that they are the same basic shape. And I'm happy to look at KEPs, and in fact, I've been flagging lots of KEPs for this purpose, to just say, like, I think the API here is generally okay, get through the implementation. Now, if you get halfway through the implementation and you realize this API doesn't work, and I need to add 6 new top-level types to make it work, then yeah, you kind of are no longer implementable.
Yeah, I think there were 3 things going on here. One was kind of the confusion about like the last minute, should this even be a native type or should it be a CRD? Like that was unfortunate, and I think confusion and like a good intention of saying, hey, there's new information that I've heard just in the past few weeks, like let's make sure we're not going the wrong direction. Hopefully we can draw clearer guidelines around what things should be implemented that way and what things shouldn't.
We should try to write up some guidelines.
The second is just the timing of this in the release, which again is unfortunate, but not really a philosophical issue. And then the third is the flow of a KEP getting reviewed and approved and marked implementable, and then the implementation getting approved. Like that's not well laid out. Like what happens at each stage, and should you even start working on an implementation like until an API approver has said, yes, the design of the KEP is good?
I mean, that all depends on how much work you're willing to redo, right? Like sometimes it's helpful to prototype things to work out the details, like do I have the right set of fields and things like that. So if you're not too attached to it, that's reasonable. If you're going to write 20,000 lines of code, probably you shouldn't go all that far before making sure that it's in the right direction. So it sort of depends on the scope and whether you have reasonable ways to scaffold it or prototype it or something.
In some ways, the scope for this was intended to be take an API type that we already spent a lot of time thinking about and just make it addressable via the REST API. And I don't think that expectation matched some of the people who were looking at the API. They were kind of like Daniel, I think, looked at it and thought, oh, here's a new API I can look at, which is true. He hadn't looked at the file audit API, but others of us had. And so like these kind of mixed messages are pretty tough. So figuring out a way to coordinate and so that when Daniel comes and says, what is this? And I'm looking at this going, oh yeah, this is what we spent a month looking at last release.
Yeah.
We can communicate that better.
Those kinds of things I also think would be good to punt up to the SIG Architecture mailing list, just to get broader visibility and discussion. Like for me, GitHub notifications are useless. It's basically random if I see something or not. So
I saw Jace's hand.
Oh.
Yeah, just quickly, just from a governance perspective, the closer we get to a release, the handoff or the chain of custody of this work goes progressively toward the release team subproject. So basically early on, you sort of have the plan, build, run thing here where you have planning is KEPs and building is really the API review and getting into the bolts and details, and then run is the sort of the release team making decisions about what's in and out kind of in the last minute. So I think that whatever we do here, we need to have some process that takes into account the different phases of each of those, because KEPs have their own life cycle, the reviews have their own life cycle, and then the release has its own life cycle. So we need to have some way of consuming that for somebody who's a contributor, so it doesn't feel like a bunch of competing processes. Brian?
Yeah, so a few things procedurally. Time check, we're running out of time. We have about 10 minutes left. And there are some questions in the chat or comments in the chat. And I want to make sure we pull action items out of this to follow up on, like document guidance about CRD versus not would be one. Clarify KEP versus API review and how those things glue together would be another. In the chat, Tim St. Clair said a flowchart would be helpful. You had a flowchart, I think, in the API review doc, which maybe we need to update once we figure out the KEP API review relationship.
Yes.
And tell people about.
And tell people about it. What other action items do we need to write down as Jace is typing in notes?
I would really like to know if having an implementable KEP ties the API reviewer's hands. Like you must approve the API if it looks like this.
Well, I think that relates to how does the KEP and API review lifecycles relate to each other, because that could only be the case if it actually got approved.
Yeah. Okay.
Before.
It just seems impractical to review an API or approve it until someone's actually built it and seen it run.
My gut reaction is that sounds silly, which is we want to do as much as we can up front, but there's always like the dotting the I's and crossing the T's at the end. We're like, are we really sure that this is the right time to do it? And let's de-escalate and set expectations appropriately so that's not surprising. And occasionally, we want to grow the boundary so that releases go out stable and more things are done out of core. That is the overarching goal of Kubernetes, the project.
So can I get a volunteer to write up a proposal for how those two processes should interact and email it out to the mailing list, like just a short description or set of bullets or something that we can iterate on in the email or in a doc?
I'm the logical person to do that since I've already taken the bullet of getting the API review process documented. So
I just want to be concise to facilitate framing the conversation.
Well, then somebody else should do it.
I can take it.
That's why I brought this up. Yeah.
I also want to just point out, like, starting threads on the SIG Arch mailing list, like, there's this kind of scary, like, if I ask, I'm just going to be told no, or I'm going to be told to do it in this way. I don't want to do it. I think we need to, like, lower the bar for things that we ask about, just to improve communication between the people who are involved in these processes. And it shouldn't be a scary thing. Like, we're all trying to do the right thing here, and we want to do it in the best way. And so, like, don't hesitate to ask.
Yeah, I second that. Again, I suggest the mailing list because I can go pull that specifically separately from the rest of my inbox in a reasonable way. So let me just see other chats. Tangential question: does an alpha feature need an E2E test? All features need E2E tests, or at least some kind of test, adequate tests. Let me just put it that way. Again, I mean, the bar is going up. One thing I've been doing, while I haven't been visible as much in the community, but we're seeing more and more reliability issues from Kubernetes, all bugs, backward compatibility breaks, instability, things like that. So I'm sort of surveying this set of issues and trying to figure out how to drive improvements in those areas. So the bar needs to go up on testing. We have a meta problem with testing, that we don't have good signal. We have lots of tests that fail all the time that nobody pays attention to. They're just too many tests, and the matrix is too complex and nobody looks at it. Or if they do look at it, they don't know what to think about it. So, we've had this issue in the past. Daniel worked on an effort to get that under control 2 years ago. It has been, a constant struggle with flakes and whatnot. But
I mean, our flakes need to go down. The flakes need to go down as the project gets bigger. It's just the bar has to go up. For this particular thing, like I would expect rather extensive unit and integration tests. Like I don't know, testing everything in E2E is wasteful and slow. But I mean,
yeah, that's a whole separate issue. We need multimodal tests that can be run in both modes.
By the way, for alpha E2E tests, they don't run in merge blocking jobs, and so you have to add them. And just because your tests are green and your PR merges doesn't mean your tests ever ran or passed.
That's a good point.
You
Another
have to
issue.
Trigger them explicitly.
Yeah, another issue is they don't run at nearly the frequency of things that are in the blocking test suites. So you can have a test that passes when it occasionally runs, and then it can have a high failure rate as soon as it gets enabled in the PR builder, and runs 1,000 times more frequently.
That seems very bad to have dead tests checked in that are like not running.
The alpha ones actually run, but they aren't merged. They aren't queue blocking, and they're frequently read because variety of things break them and people don't notice. And so
there's Aaron's not here, but there are layers and layers to this test grid now. So many layers that it's actually hard to keep track of. But inside of one of those layers is a set of regexes that allow for feature time-based. The feature tag tests are run, and that's the typical example. Is it that even if they're alpha, they're just feature gated, so they have like a feature colon thing with extra configuration for the initialization that allows them to be enabled.
Right. Just my observation in the past is if they run in the PR builder, they run hundreds to thousands of times more frequently than any other test, and that exhibits problems that aren't otherwise surfaced. Anyway, we're almost out of time. So did you get the answer you needed, Dims, on that? Okay. Flowcharts, features. So Clayton answered it in the chat. Okay. So we got action items. Take a look at them in the notes. And one thing I would like to start doing is talk about what we want to talk about next time. So it's not just me putting together the agenda or people randomly dropping items on. So do folks have things they want to discuss next week?
I'm sure the answer is yes, but I don't know what they are.
Anybody else?
I mean, we had the thread going on alpha gates. Like, is it time to circle back on that? Do we feel like the thread is making progress? Is it dead?
I haven't had time to look at it.
Exactly.
Yeah. Like I said, July and August were just painful.
Well, and to be fair, like we had a Google event this week, so a lot of us were out.
I've had events every week since the beginning of July. Okay, so anyway, I am gonna just request people to think about agenda in advance. We do have the tracking boards, and we are gonna try to use that. I am trying to put more energy and time into conformance, especially. That's higher on my priority list, and reliability as well. I'm looking at that, and then the processes, as opposed to moving forward individual issues, like individual new features. Sorry, but that is not a high priority for me. At this point, we have lots and lots of features that are poorly tested and poorly documented. We don't need more of those. So, figuring out how to provide more coherency, quality, reliability, and so on by changing how we do things. It's kind of the meta problems that we have is sort of what I'm thinking about right now.
I would love to talk about that next week. I have a laundry list of items about that stuff.
All right, awesome. Let's talk about that next week.
Yeah, one last thing from me. So on that email thread, we were talking about the alpha gates. How do we? Is there a false for the alpha gate and stuff like that? So I posted a concrete example. I would like to hear next week from you guys. What exactly we need to do there, because people were talking and it was hard to figure out what exactly I have to go fix, if at all.
Okay, so let's close on, or at least make progress in the alpha gates next week as well.
Yeah, sounds good. Thank you.
Okay, and there is Labor Day coming up, so you have a day off. Enjoy it.
Nice long weekend. I don't want to see any email.
Good luck with that. But yes, have a nice long weekend. Anyway, thanks a lot. Let's chat next week. If something else does come up, drop it in the agenda doc.
All right, thanks everybody. Have a good day.
Thanks.